Hello and welcome to Get the Table. I'm Adam Wilbourn from WhatCulture, joined by Andrew Pollard from WhatCulture to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts where we review Raw, SmackDown, the Wednesday Night War between AEW and NXT pay-per-views. We have interviews, roundtable discussions, and a roundup of the week, complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But as I said, joined by Andrew Pollard to discuss the new book on André the Giant. I've got it written down here. The Eighth Wonder of the World, the true story of André the Giant. Now, Andrew, you've read this book and written a wonderful list up at whatculture.com of things we've learned from it. Before we get into that, though, we were talking about JR's book recently. How does this one compare?
I think for a lot of wrestling fans, they are very different books because this one about André, one, it's a little bit longer. About an extra 100 about 100 pages or so on this one, and it's very facts driven. Not saying JR's isn't factual, it is, but JR's, there's a lot more emotion to it because it's Jim Ross telling his story. This is a couple of other people, Bertrand Ebert, who worked on Pat Patterson's book, and Pat LaPrade, who worked on the HBO documentary on André from, I think that was 2018, may have been last year. But either way, the one that was really, really good. But yeah, this is somebody else clearly telling André the Giant story. So it's very much driven by dates and facts and anecdotes from people who were around André rather than André telling his own story. But it's a very, very good read. I feel almost a little bit spoiled because wrestling books, some when they're great, they're really good. When they're not so great, they can be tough reads. So I feel quite lucky that these two back to back have been two really, really good work. I'd say the JR book was slightly edgy for me. But again, that's just because it's Jim Ross telling his own very personal, very emotional story. But this one, I think I probably learned a lot more from this one because for the simple fact of, we've all seen and heard Jim Ross for years in the best possible way. Whereas André, there's a lot in here that maybe you wouldn't be aware of, but it is. It's driven by cold hard facts and statistics. So it's a. Try to think of the best way to phrase it. It's a really interesting read, but it's a more focused read, I guess. Should we say?
It's following, as you said, in incredible footsteps of that documentary on André, which I think every self-respecting wrestling fan should watch, just because it really gives you a true reflection of what an incredible man he was, what an amazing career he had, but also the difficulties he went through. Let's start by talking about this book then and the beginning of André the Giant's career. You talk about his humble beginnings in the red light district of all places.
Yeah, it's again, this was completely. I like to think of myself as relatively knowledgeable on something like André the Giant because I'm a massive wrestling nerd and I'm also old. So I was around to see him, not necessarily in his heyday, but around to see him towards the latter part of his career. But yeah, going back to his humble beginnings, it's. Yeah, the training school or the training facility he went to with a chap called Aubert Lagier, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not. As I'm French since I was about 14. It was in a suburb of Paris called, I think it's Pagille, P-A-G-I-L-L-E, which was just so happens to be where Moulin Rouge is to this day. And back when André was training in what would be the 60s, it was very much sex shows, adult themed places, the sort of place you could go and spend lots of money on whatever your fancy was, should we say. And while he was training there, André, it doesn't particularly say that he made the most of those facilities, but he did make some friends in the prostitutes of the area and ended up to make ends meet. He ended up working as protection for the prostitutes, which is like, just, if you get one of those crazy horned up people who go a little bit over the top and then you pull out the giant, and that should, take the proverbial wind out of any proverbial sails, should we say, for lack of a better term. So I thought that was really interesting to hear about with that. And also, we've heard over the years that this chap, Aubert Lagier, I just looked to my right because that's where I have it written down, so I'm ingrained in my head, that he's always said that he saw the giant in Paris and went straight for him and was like, oh, do you want to be a wrestler? Why aren't you a wrestler? Whereas this story, from speaking to André's brothers and family, and that's a good thing, because it does, throughout this, it does reference the HBO documentary, and it also it speaks to all the people who were the closest to André. So you get it from not the horse's mouth, but as close as we can get. The story goes that André was already wanting to be a wrestler before he met Aubert Lagier, and he'd moved to Paris purely to train and become a wrestler. So he was already in the mindset of this is my dream. And then he's working on doors at clubs. He was working in warehouses, doing anything he could. Like I said, he was paid protection for the prostitutes of the area he was training in. So he was doing whatever he could until he could realize his wrestling dream. And obviously he go on to become one of the most recognizable and larger than life presences in the history of professional wrestling and pop culture, not just wrestling.
Indeed. I want to get on to his legendary appetite in due course.
Yes.
So we all know about his drinking exploits, but there's a list of meals or even just foods that he ate in one sitting that will have your jaw on the floor. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk about his insane schedule because, you know, obviously we think of him in the WWF and his feuds with, you know, the likes of Hulk Hogan, obviously spring to mind, which I want to get to as well. Yeah. But he was working crazy amounts of days.
Yeah, it was before he essentially made it big time. I mean, he'd made it big time. He'd worked in his home country. He'd worked in Canada. He spent some time over here in the UK. His very first singles loss ever came over here in the UK against Kendo Nagasaki, of all people. So he'd been all around the world, and he'd seemingly settled in Montreal for Grand Prix with the Vachons, with Paul Vachon, the brother of Maurice Mad Dog Vachon. And he was. It's that thing of diminishing returns, I guess, with somebody. It's bizarre to think that André the Giant, you'd ever get tired of seeing André the Giant or ever less surprised. But if you're seeing a giant in your local territory every week or every month, then it loses its luster like anything would. If you eat the same your favorite chocolate bar every day, all of a sudden, I want to try something else. And so it was trying to keep André fresh by moving him from all the areas, and that was the big thing with Vince McMahon Sr. Because it was from Grand Prix that André would end up being spotted by Vince McMahon Sr. That the Vachons were in New York having a talk with Vince, and Vince brought up the Giant and whether they think he'd go to New York, and he did. And then from there, Vince McMahon Sr. had control of his bookings, and he'd essentially loan out the Giant to all the promoters so that he'd stay fresh in whichever area he went to, and McMahon would get a percentage of the cut. But then it was more when Vince Jr. took over, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, that's when obviously he was looking for not just regional dominance, but national dominance, and as we see today, international dominance. Vince McMahon wanted to rule the world. And that meant that André's schedule started to pick up to insane levels. I mean, I've got it written down here. He rarely did TV interviews at this point in time, but he was back in Canada for a Montreal show in 1983, where he did this TV interview, and he just broke down his schedule before that. There was on the Thursday, he was in Jackson, Mississippi. On the Friday, Houston, Texas. The Saturday afternoon was Texarkana in Texas. The Saturday night was Little Rock, Texas. The Sunday afternoon was Lafayette in Louisiana. Then Lake Charles, Louisiana on the Sunday night. Then he drove for 20 miles to get to Montreal. And his schedule over those few days was 1,300 miles. And this is, I mean, that would be uncomfortable for anybody. But you've got this dude who is in the 7-foot region, whatever height you want to build, what you want to believe is build height. So you've got the literal giant of a man crammed into cars, crammed into planes. And this, unfortunately, at this point, because everybody wanted to see André the Giant. And this was his insane schedule. And he wasn't built for it. And it's key to emphasize how not of the norm this was at the time, because the WWF, still the WWF at that point, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, it was only in the infancy of its boom of the rock and roll wrestling, which was just around the corner, where it really went national and international. So not every wrestler was insanely traveling nationally. It was all about states and areas and the territories you'd work there. So yeah, André was ahead of his time in his travel schedule, but obviously it's not great for him. And that was by this time in 1983. This is when he was getting larger. He'd been drinking more. He'd been putting on more weight, and just with his condition, he was transforming before our eyes every time you see him on TV. So yeah, it was insanity.
It's shocking and a little bit heartbreaking. I mean, I watched when Jake the Snake was on Joe Rogan's podcast a while ago and telling stories about traveling around with him and how much he had to suffer for his art, as well as just existing as well. I want to talk about this legendary appetite of his. We've heard the stories of his drinking exploits over the years, but I don't think anyone's really, certainly as far as I know, chronicled the amount of food, not that he could put away per se, but the amount he arguably needed to just continue existing.
Yeah, it's like any sort of I guess vehicle. In this case, Andre the Giant's the vehicle. You've got to keep it fueled. We all need food or caffeine to keep us getting us through the day. And when you're 7 foot tall and 400, 500 pounds, whatever, then you need a lot more than the average bear, boo-boo. But this example they give is a time in New Zealand where they'd gone to a Chinese restaurant and Andre had a plate of scallops, which is detailed in the book that he knocked back like a bowl of peanuts. Then that was followed up by 2 bowls of soup. Then there was a portion of pork chow mein, which was then followed quickly by a second portion of pork chow mein. I think I'd be tapping out like a Kurt Angle victim at this point in time. But then he was just getting started, because then he moved on to a large rump steak with a side of French fries, some onions, eggs, tomatoes, followed by peaches and ice cream, with 2 bottles of Coca-Cola and washed down as well with 2 cups of coffee. And that was just one meal in his day. He'd have that sort of meal usually at least 3 times a day. And it's insane. That's like, today I've been doing an online supermarket shop, and it's like, yeah, that this is the kind of stuff that would do me for a week, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. It is truly astonishing. And then it is and it isn't, because then you think of that image of his hand with a beer can in it, and you think, no, that's totally believable. In fact, what I really like about this book is that there's revelations not just about Andre, but about some of his closest relationships. I want to talk about his bond with Vince McMahon Sr. in a second, but before that, an interesting story about Hulk Hogan and Jerry Lawler as a manager to tell us about.
Yeah, Jerry Lawler pops up in 2 notable ways in this book. The first of which is his kind of infamous faux win that he claimed that he had over Andre the Giant and told Bill Apter about, and it got published in all the news across America, which wasn't the case. And Jerry Lawler was just trying to get take his own next step to superstardom, and that didn't go down well with Vince Sr. But yeah, the bond with Vince Sr. was a very special one. But obviously his bond with Hulk Hogan, it's from reading the Eighth Wonder of the World, there are times when it's a very fractious relationship between Hulk and Andre, particularly towards when we get in. You clearly see that Hulk Hogan is the next guy for the business, for the wrestling industry, and Andre's still the Giant. He's the attraction. He doesn't need a world title. But no, to go way back before then, and it's when Hogan's just first started training, and he was playing bass in a band, which wasn't Metallica, but he was playing bass in a band nonetheless. There's even images of him in here, so it's like, all right, okay, maybe that is true. But not Metallica by sure. But no, Hogan, when as part of his training, he went to Memphis, working under Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett, and he proposed to Jerry Lawler. This was, I think he was going by, I think it was just Terry Boulder at the time, or he might have started using Hulk in there somewhere at this point in time. But yeah, his proposal to Jerry Lawler was that he wanted Jerry Lawler to essentially be his Vince McMahon Sr. I talked earlier about how when Vince had Andre, he would borrow Andre to various promoters and organizations and manage him, be a very, very real life manager for the Giant. And that's what Hogan wanted Jerry Lawler to do. He wanted Jerry Lawler to get him bookings, to send him through all the territories. Jerry Lawler would get a cut of the percentage of whatever Hogan would draw in these houses that he'd go working on. And Jerry Lawler just had zero interest. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was just he thought that Hulk Hogan had zero future in the wrestling business. He wouldn't draw a dime, and he was, for all intents and purposes, pretty useless. And I mean, love him or hate him, there's no arguing Hulk Hogan's place as one of the greatest of all time. Some would say the greatest of all time, depending on what you're going to base it on. But Jerry Lawler got that one way wrong. And it wouldn't be long until, I think it was a year later, that Hogan, he was given the Incredible Hulk Hogan name by Vince McMahon Sr., and he'd begin working for the WWF at that point.
Jerry Lawler getting things more wrong than the image that I've seen of Terry Boulder with his precisely shaved chest. Yeah.
Might be.
Very quickly about that Jerry Lawler thing, because I was astonished to read about that. So for people who are unaware, did Jerry Lawler beat Andre the Giant?
No, but if you listen to Jerry Lawler, and if you were around in, I want to say 1976. It's detailed in the article. It's detailed in the book, obviously, the exact date. It was in the Louisville Gardens. I know that. And it was billed as Andre the Giant versus Jerry Lawler. Like I said, this was a Jerry Lawler who he wasn't yet the king of Memphis. He was working his way up, trying to make a name for himself. The match did take place. The match was advertised to take place. And Jerry Lawler, as it was back then, this is clearly way before the internet. And it was a case of, it was relied upon, the wrestling magazines of the day would rely on getting their information from the wrestling promoters, from the wrestlers themselves. And in this case, Jerry Lawler wrote to Bill Apter in New York, which is a long way from Kentucky, and just said, yeah, when this match happened, I beat the Giant. And Jerry Lawler billed himself as a midget for this. There's a famous headline of Andre the Giant gets defeated by a midget. And Lawler classed himself as a midget. He said he was 5'6", which in reality I think he's closer to 6 foot. But he billed himself as 5'6". Went on a very I'm doing it for all the small people. That was in this article he sent to Bill Apter. Yeah. And by his accounts, he'd toppled the Giant. He'd got him in a hold and managed to throw Andre over the top rope where the Giant was counted out. And Lawler got this famous victory. And there was photos of the two in the ring. There was credence to Lawler's story. If you're just blind and you're Bill Apter and you're just getting this information of like, oh wow, well, this match did take place, I know that. Lawler said he won. Why would I not believe him? There's photos to back up that yeah, he was on top of the Giant. Wow, this is a big shocking story. It didn't happen like that. They quote Jim Cornette in this book, who was there because Jim Cornette, Louisville Gardens, he was always there. And he just said that what actually happened was it was Dennis Condrey and somebody else ran into for interference, getting a DQ win for Andre, and Andre laid the three of them out, the two interfering and Jerry Lawler. So yeah, it was a DQ win for Andre the Giant, but for the longest period in time, everybody thought that it was the king. Well, he wasn't the king at this point in time. It was Jerry Lawler getting a win, which would have skyrocketed him to this next level of superstardom, which he would ultimately get to. And then this didn't sit well with Vince Sr. either. At the next NWA conference that they had, he brought it up, which is a couple of months later, because there was a very specific instructions that whenever he let Andre out to wrestle anywhere, he was never to lose a singles match. So while he didn't lose, it was portrayed that he lost, and Vince thought it was detrimental to the wrestling business, period, because it was taking some of the shine off the biggest star in the business at that time.
I just love the idea of Jerry Lawler just going, here's a photo of the two of us in a ring. I definitely won. And, this is before, as you said, he became the household name that he is. I mean, if you're going to try and make a name for yourself, beating Andre is one hell of a way to do it. Yeah. I want to conclude here, Andrew, with on a lighter note, talking a little bit more about Andre's bond with Vince McMahon Sr., because, we've known about his association with the WWF, or whatever you want to call them. But it does sound like there's a genuine relationship there, rather than certainly in the present day, the sort of far more cold exchange of services that we have in modern day wrestling at times.
Yeah. I mean, you can say Vince Jr. is a genius, and he's also a devil, but he's very much one of those, like so many wrestling promoters, where they're the best of buds with their top stars of the day, but as soon as they can see that young lion coming over the hill, and they're weighing up putting this old guy to pasture, then that relationship changes. But that was never really the case with Vince Sr. And Andre the Giant, and it was Vince Sr., yes, he was looking out for his top star. Yes, he was looking out for the most unique attraction in the history of professional wrestling. But it was more than that. You read this, and it was almost like a father figure, a father and a really ginormous son relationship that they had. Where when Vince Sr. Andre would be out working other territories on behalf of Vince Sr. And any problems that Andre had with the promoters would ring Vince. And there's a bit in here where the Giant was just after more money because he was at the bar and he was getting exceedingly drunk. And this promoter, whose name eludes me right now, rings Vince Sr. and is told, whatever he wants, do it, whatever it costs, just do it. And as soon as it's done, I'll send you the money. And that became the relationship that Vince Sr. had with all these other promoters, where Andre had free reign to have whatever he needed, whether it was financial, whatever sort of help he needed. It was very much a just do it, don't even ask, just do it, and I'll reimburse you down the line. But it was, you see in this, Andre is is he by this point in time that he ends up in the WWF, WWF, he has been around the world by then. He long left France, but it's a lonely world being Andre the Giant. That's we saw that in the documentary. We you really appreciate that in this, and there's only really lots of wrestlers say it that when you leave the wrestling business, you can count your true friends on one hand. And yeah, it's a giant hand, but Vince Senior would have been one of the few true friends that Andre had in this. He was always looking out for his best interests, as in Andre's best interests, pronouns pal, but also looking out for the company's interests and money, because wrestling pal. But yeah, it's striking when you see the relationship that Andre has with Vince Senior, and then the one he has with Vince Jr., where it's a very different dynamic. Yes, Vince McMahon Jr., Vincent Kennedy McMahon, was good to the Giant and was a huge fan of his, was a friend of his, but it was very much, it was business with Vince Jr. There was a lot more of that to it. And yeah, okay, they're friends at the time, and while they're on the way, that's great, but he was making sure that Andre was going from town to town, regardless of Andre's ailing health as the years would go by.
It's a truly fascinating tale. If you want to find out any more about it, it's well worth checking out Andrew's article up at whatculture.com, 12 things we learnt from this book, The Eighth Wonder of the World, the true story of Andre the Giant. Well worth checking out the book on the whole as well, because it sounds absolutely fantastic. Andrew, it's been a pleasure to chat to you. Thank you so much for letting us know all that. Where can people find you on Twitter?
At Cultured Left Peg, where today I'll mainly be making tweets about Wrexham survival in the National League. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
You can follow me at Adam Wilbourn, where I'll be making tweets about Chesterfield survival in the National League. And make sure you follow us all at WhatCulture WWE on Twitter. Make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling for daily wrestling podcasts. And as I said, make sure you check out all of Andrew's articles over whatculture.com and the book, The Eighth Wonder of the World, the true story of Andre the Giant. This has been Get the Table. My thanks to Andrew Pollard. Thanks you for watching, and we will see you soon.